The ensuing debate in the House and Senate flamed over all creation, but it started with a note of moral triumph. The newly elected speaker declared, "The fires of civil war have broken every fetter in the land," and proved the funeral pyre of slavery. The chaplain of the Senate increased this moral afflatus with religious fervor, thankful that the Statue of Freedom now looks down from our capital upon an entire nation of free men, and that we are permitted, by the dispensation of thy providence, and the way being prepared, to give liberty to the captive, the opening of the prison to them that are bound, and to proclaim the acceptable year of our God. The chaplain of the House said, "O God, we stand today on the soil of a nation which is, not alone by inference or report, but by the solemn announcement of the constituted authorities, declared free in every part and parcel of its territory. Blessed be thy name, O God, for thy wonderful ending of this terrible conflict." Congressional amendments of every sort poured into Congress concerning the national and Confederate debt, the civil rights of freedmen, the establishment of republican government, the basis of representation, payment for slaves, and the future powers of federal government and the states. Arguments swirled in a maelstrom of logic. No matter where it started and how far afield in legal metaphysics it strayed, always it returned and had to return to two focal points. Shall the South be rewarded for unsuccessful secession by increased political power? And can the freed Negro be a part of American democracy? Thither all argument again and again returned, but it tried desperately to crowd out these real points by appealing to higher constitutional metaphysics. This constitutional argument was astonishing. Around and around it went in dizzy, silly dialects. Here were grown, sensible men arguing about a written form of government adopted 90 years before, when men did not believe that slavery could outlive their generation in this country, or that civil war could possibly be its result. When no man foresaw the Industrial Revolution or the rise of the Cotton Kingdom. And yet now, with incantation and abracadabra, the leaders of a nation tried to peer back into the magical crystal and out of a bit of paper called the Constitution, find eternal and immutable law laid down for their guidance forever and ever. Amen. They knew perfectly well that no such omniscient law existed or ever had existed. Yet, in order to conceal the fact, they twisted and distorted and argued. These states are dead, but states can never die. These states have gone out of the Union, but states can never go out of the Union, and to prevent this, we fought and won a war. But while we were fighting, these states were certainly not in the Union, else why did we fight? And how now may they come back? They are already back because they were never really out. Then what were we fighting for? For a union. But we had union and we have got union. Only these constituent states are dead and we must bring them to life. But states never die. Then they have forfeited statehood and become territories. But statehood cannot be forfeited. Conspirators within the states interfered, and now the interference has stopped. But as long as the interference lasted, there was surely no union. Oh, yes, only it did not function. We need not now provide for its functioning again, for the Constitution already provides for that. Where was the Constitution during the war? But the war is ended. And now the Constitution prevails. Unless the Constitution prevails, this is no nation. There is no president. We have no real Congress since it does not represent the nation. But who represented the nation during the war? And by that token, who saved the nation and killed slavery? Shall the nation that saved the nation now surrender its power to rebels who fought to preserve slavery? There are no rebels. The South is loyal and slavery is dead. How can the loyalty of the South be guaranteed? And has the black slave been made really free? No. Freedom is a matter of state right. So was secession. Must we fight that battle over again? Yes. If you try to make monkeys equal to men, what caused the war but your own insistence that men were at... Lord, I'm sorry. That is okay. Let's try that again. I'm going to read that sentence one more time. Must we fight that battle over again? Yes, if you try to make monkeys equal to men. What caused the war but your own insistence that men were at once monkeys in real estate? Gentlemen, and fellow Americans, let us have peace. But what is peace? Is it slavery of all poor men and increased political power for the slaveholders? Do you want to wreak vengeance on the conquered and the unfortunate? Do you want to reward rebellion by increased power to rebels? And so on, around and up and down, day after day, week after week, with only here and there a keen, straight mind to cut the cobwebs and to say in effect with Seward through Johnson, damn the nigger. Let us settle down to work and trade, or to declare with Stevens and Sumner, make the slaves free with land, education, and the ballot, and then let the South return to its place. Or to say with Blaine and Conkling and Bingham, not in words but in action, guard property and industry. When their position is impregnable, let the South return. We will then hold it with black votes until we capture it with white capital. After all this blather, the nation and its Congress found itself back to the two plain problems: the basis of representation in Congress and the status of the Negro. When it came to the Negro, the old dogmatism leapt to the fore and would not down. Chandler of New York regarded Farnsworth's demand for Negro equality as not only an attack on foreigners, but an insult to white citizens. When the Constitution said people, it meant white people. And he stood for the purity of the white race. Fink declared that Ohio would never let Negroes vote with his consent. This is, and of right, ought to be a white man's government, said Boyer of Pennsylvania. And he declared that 18 of the 25 states now represented in Congress would not let the Negro vote. Yet the argument for freedom and democracy loomed high and clear. Slavery, but a short time ago received as a God-given condition of men, has fallen under the banner of a purer morality and come down with the curses of a Christian world. With the fall of slavery must also fall the things pertaining thereto. The master who yesterday had his heel upon the neck of his slave today meets that slave upon the level of common equality. The Negro should be carefully considered in this question of Reconstruction, for after all, we are our brother's keeper, and we must see that even-handed justice is meted out to the black man, if possible. Woodbridge of Vermont declared, new social and political relations have been established. 4 million people have been born in a day. The shackles have been stricken from 4 million chattels, and they have become in an hour living, thinking, moving, responsible beings and citizens of these United States. And if Congress does not do something to provide for these people, if they do not prove equal to their duty and come up to their work like men, the condition of the people will be worse than before. The South, represented by the border states, had to confine itself to constitutional metaphysics, or else blurt out, as some of its spokesmen did, a new defense of the old slavery. The West, on the other hand, had a real and disturbing argument, and it was voiced by Voorhees, in his dramatic attempt to drive a wedge between Johnson and the Republicans. He said, January 6th, 1866, "How long can the inequalities of our present revenue system be borne? How long will the poor and laborers pay tribute to the rich and the idle? We have two great interests in this country, one of which has prostrated the other. The past 4 years of suffering and war has been the opportune harvest of the manufacturer. The looms and machine shops of New England and the iron furnaces of Pennsylvania have been more prolific of wealth to their owners than the most dazzling gold mines of the earth. They are the results of class legislation, of a monopoly of trade established by law. It may be said that they indicate prosperity. Most certainly they do. But it is the prosperity of one who obtains the property of his neighbor without any equivalent in return. The present law of tariff is being rapidly understood. It is no longer a deception, but rather a well-defined and clearly recognized outrage. The agricultural labor of the land is driven to the counters of the most gigantic monopoly ever before sanctioned by law. From its exorbitant demands, there is no escape. The European manufacturer is forbidden our ports of trade for fear he might sell his goods at cheaper rates and thus relieve the burden of the consumer. We have declared by law that there is but one market in which our citizens shall go to make their purchases, and we have left it to the owners of the markets to fix their own prices. This was another unanswerable argument. But having made it, what was Voorhees's remedy? His logical remedy would have been to unite the industrial democracy of the West with the abolition democracy of the East in order to fight oligarchy in northern industry and the attempt to reestablish agricultural oligarchy in the South. Yet, this was farthest from his intention. His immediate effort was to embarrass and split the Republicans by forcing them to endorse or repudiate their own president and leader. His ultimate program, if he had one, was to seek with Andrew Johnson to restore oligarchy in the South with a dominant planter class and serfdom for the emancipated Negroes. This was unthinkable, and it deprived the radical West of all moral sympathy and voting power which its economic revolt deserved. What was it the nation wanted? Charles Sumner told the nation what it ought to want, but there was no doubt but that it did not yet want this. Thaddeus Stevens knew what the nation ought to want, but as a practical politician, his business was to see how much of this he could get enacted into actual law. There came before the 39th Congress some 140 different proposals to change the Constitution of the United States, including 45 on apportionment, 31 on civil and political rights, and 13 forbidding payment for slaves. Over half of these affected the status of the freedmen. Before the committee of 15 could sift these and settle to its larger task of fixing the future basis of representation and the degree of national guardianship which Negro freedom called for, there seemed to be two measures upon which public opinion in the North was so far crystallized that legislation might safely be attempted. These were a permanent Freedmen's Bureau and a bill to protect the civil rights of Negroes. On the first day of business of the 39th Congress, there were introduced into the Senate two bills on these subjects. The Civil Rights Bill was taken up December 13th, but Sherman of Ohio reminded the Senate that there was scarcely a state in the Union that did not make distinctions on account of color, and wished, therefore, to postpone action until the 13th Amendment had been adopted. Salisbury of Maryland called it an insane effort to elevate the African race to the dignity of the white race, and claimed that the 13th Amendment would carry no such power as Sherman assumed. Trumbull of Illinois, on the contrary, declared that the second section of the 13th Amendment, as reported by his committee, was drawn for the very purpose of conferring upon Congress authority to see that the first section was carried out in good faith, and for none other. And I hold that under that second section, Congress will have the authority, when the constitutional amendment is adopted, not only to pass the bill of the senator from Massachusetts, but a bill that will be much more efficient to protect the freedman in his rights. We may, if deemed advisable, continue the Freedmen's Bureau, clothe it with additional powers, and if necessary, back it up with a military force to see that the rights of the men made free by the first clause of the constitutional amendment are protected. And, sir, when the constitutional amendment shall have been adopted, if the information from the South be that the men whose liberties are secured by it are deprived of the privilege to go and come when they please, to buy and sell when they please, to make contracts and enforce contracts, I give notice that, if no one else does, I shall introduce a bill and urge its passage through Congress that will secure to those men every one of these rights. They would not be free men without them. Congress asked the president for the specific facts concerning the situation in the South. The president replied with the report of General Grant, containing the superficial results of a hasty 5-day trip, and disingenuously tried to suppress the report of Carl Schurz, undoubtedly the most thoroughgoing and careful inquiry into the situation just after the war that had been made. Sumner expressed his indignation and the evident need of a civil rights bill.
When I think of what occurred yesterday in this chamber, when I call to mind the attempt to whitewash the unhappy condition of the rebel states, and to throw the mantle of official oblivion over sickening and heart-rending outrages where human rights are sacrificed and rebel barbarism receives a new letter of license, I feel that I ought to speak of nothing else. I stood here years ago in the days of Kansas when a small community was surrendered to the machinations of slave masters. I now stand here again when, alas, an immense region with millions of people has been surrendered to the machinations of slave masters. Sir, it is the duty of Congress to stress this fatal fury. Congress must dare to be brave. It must dare to be just. He claimed that the Civil Rights Bill aimed simply to carry out and maintain the Proclamation of Emancipation, by which this republic is solemnly pledged to maintain the emancipated slave in his freedom. Such is our pledge. And the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authority thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons. This pledge is without any limitation in space or time. It is as extended and as immoral as the republic itself. Does anybody call it vain words? I trust not. To that pledge we are solemnly bound. Wherever our flag floats, as long as time endures, we must see that it is sacredly observed. But the performance of that pledge cannot be entrusted to another. Least of all can it be entrusted to the old slave masters embittered against their slaves. It must be performed by the national government. The power that gave freedom must see that this freedom is maintained. This is according to reason. It is also according to the examples of history. In the British West Indies, we find this teaching. 3 of England's greatest orators and statesmen, Burke, Canning, and Brougham, at successive periods, united in declaring, from the experience in the British West Indies, that whatever the slave masters undertook to do for their slaves was always arrant trifling, and that whatever might be its plausible form, it always wanted the executive principle. More recently, the Emperor of Russia, when ordering emancipation, declared that all efforts of his predecessors in this direction had failed because they had been left to the spontaneous initiative of the proprietors. I might say much more on this head, but this is enough. I assume that no such blunder will be made on our part, that we shall not leave to the old proprietors the maintenance of that freedom to which we are pledged, and thus break our own promises and sacrifice a race. But Congress was not yet ready for this high ground, and Sumner's scheme was widely criticized. Whitelaw Reid, in a letter to the Cincinnati Gazette, March 3rd, 1868, recalled the profound surprise and bitterness of feeling with which Sumner's remarks were received by senators. Republican journals and leaders within the inner circles of the party were hostile. The Republicans were especially afraid of any split with the president, lest this bring the Democrats into power. Forney of the Philadelphia Press begged Sumner to yield for the sake of harmony within the great political army in which he had been a conscientious and courageous leader. Protests against President Johnson's policy were therefore slow in expression. The nation was weary of war and objected to military administration in the South. Capitalists wanted pacification of the Southern Territory to open a market closed for 4 years. They wanted any method which would bring the quickest results. Moreover, Republicans held some of the largest states of the North by narrow majorities. Any unpopular step might put the Democrats in power. Office holders did not want to break with Johnson, and candidates for office were timid. Congress made in effect the first overture to the South, and instead of forcing civil and possibly political rights, turned to take up the bill which proposed government guardianship and tutelage for the blacks. The Civil Rights Bill was postponed, and the Freedmen's Bureau Bill, which Johnson's message seemed to accept, was substituted. This was introduced as an amendment to the Act of March 3, 1865, and contained the following propositions. 1. That the Bureau should continue in force until abolished by law. 2. That it should embrace the whole country wherever there were freedmen and refugees. 3. That Bureau officials should have annual salaries of $500 to $1,200. 4. That presidents should set apart for the use of freedmen and loyal refugees unoccupied lands in the South to be allotted in parcels not exceeding 40 acres each. 5. That the titles granted in pursuance of General Sherman's orders of January 16, 1865 be made valid. 6. That the commissioner procure land and erect suitable buildings as asylums and schools for dependent freedmen and refugees. 7. That it be the duty of the president to extend military protection and jurisdiction over all cases where any of the civil rights or immunities belonging to white persons, including the rights to make and enforce contracts, to give evidence, to inherit, buy, sell, and hold property, etc., are refused or denied by local law, prejudice on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, or where different punishments or penalties are inflicted than are prescribed for white persons committing like offenses. 8. That it be made a misdemeanor, punishable by a fine of $1,000 or imprisonment for 1 year or both, for anyone depriving another of the above rights on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. These last sections were to apply to those states or districts where ordinary judicial proceedings had been interfered with by war. The bill was opposed as establishing a permanent bureau instead of a wartime emergency institution. Its great power was criticized, and it declared that its expense would be enormous. There were special objections to the validation of land titles under Sherman's orders and to the section on civil rights. It was defended as being not necessarily permanent, as in accordance with our Indian policy, and as not being expensive, since it was manned by Army officers. It passed the Senate in January 1866 by a vote of 37 to 10. In the House, Thaddeus Stevens tried to strengthen the bill by the most thoroughgoing provisions for government guardianship yet proposed. These provisions directed that food, clothes, medical attention, and transportation be furnished white refugees and black freedmen and their families, that public land be set aside in Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and Arkansas, and also from forfeited estates to the extent of 3 million acres of good land. And that this should be parceled out to loyal white refugees and black freedmen at a rental not to exceed 10 cents an acre. My God. And that at the end of a certain period, this land be sold to the applicants at a price not to exceed $2 an acre. The occupants of land under Sherman's order were confirmed in their possession, unless the former owner proved his title, and in that case, other land at the rate of 40 acres, a farm should be given to the applicant. The Bureau was to erect buildings for asylums and schools and provide a common school education for all white refugees and freedmen who applied. This thoroughgoing substitute unhappily was lost. What a world it would have been. The bill, which finally passed the House February 6th, extended the power of the Freedmen's Bureau to freedmen throughout the whole United States and provided for food and clothing for the destitute, a distribution of public lands among freedmen and white refugees in parcels not exceeding 40 acres, each at a nominal rent and with an eventual chance of purchasing. The land assigned by Sherman was to be held for 3 years and then, if restored, other land secured by rent or purchase. School buildings and asylums were to be erected when Congress appropriated the money. Full civil rights were to be enforced, and punishment was provided for those thwarting the civil rights of Negroes. This bill encountered strong opposition, especially from the border states. Salisbury of Delaware deliberately reiterated his contention that Congress had no right to abolish slavery, even if 3/4 of the states assented. With minor changes, the bill was accepted by the Senate, February 9th, and thus the first great measure of Reconstruction went to the president. Southern slavery had now been definitely abolished by constitutional amendment, and government guardianship of the Negro with land and court protection was assured by a permanent Freedmen's Bureau. What was the answer of the South to this? Where were Southern brains and leadership? Why did so many hide like tombs? Why did the South have to trust its guidance to a half-educated, poor white president and a New York corporation lawyer? Suppose a Southern leader had appeared at the time and had said, frankly, "We propose to make the Negro actually free in his right to work, his legal status, and his personal safety. We are going to allow him to get, on easy terms, homesteads so as gradually to replace the plantation system with peasant proprietors. And we are going to provide him and our poor whites with elementary schools. And when, in time, he is able to read and write and accumulate a minimum of property, then, and not until then, he can cast a vote and be represented in Congress." What was there so wild and revolutionary, so unthinkable about a manly declaration of this sort? But a native of Alabama knew that this attitude was entirely lacking. I do not think that Congress should wait for the people of the South to make regulations by which, at some future time, the Negroes will be provided with homes, have their rights as freemen acknowledged, be given a participation in civil rights, and be made a part of the framework of the country. They will not do that. You need not wait for it. If Congress can constitutionally commence a system of educating and elevating the Negroes, let them do it, and not wait for the people of the South to do it. It is nonsense to say that the South knew nothing about the capabilities of the Negro race. Southerners knew Negroes far better than Northerners. There was not a single Negro slave owner who did not know dozens of Negroes just as capable of learning and efficiency as the mass of poor white people around and about, and some quite as capable as the average slaveholder. They had continually, in the course of the history of slavery, recognized such men. Here and there, teachers and preachers to white folks as well as colored folks had arisen. Artisans and even artists had been recognized. Some of these colored folks were blood relatives of the white slaveholders, brothers and sisters, sons and daughters. They had sometimes been given land, transported to the North or to Europe, freed and encouraged. Of course, the Southerners believed such persons to be exceptional, but all that was asked of them at this time was to recognize the possibility of exceptions. To such a reasonable offer, the nation could and would have responded. It could have paid for the Negroes' land and education. It could have contributed to relief and restoration of the South. Instead of that came a determination to reestablish slavery, murder, arson, and flogging, a dogmatic opposition to Negro education and decent legal status, determination to have political power based on voteless Negroes, and no vote to any Negro under any circumstances. This showed the utter absence of common sense in the leadership of the South. Their attitude was expressed best, however, not by a Southerner, but by William H. Seward, and it came in the shape of a veto to the Freedmen's Bureau Bill. If this veto had applied to a civil rights bill or to a bill providing for Negro suffrage, it would have been much more logical. But to veto a bill for the guardianship of Negroes, even though that bill carried and had to carry a defense of civil rights, was reactionary to the last degree. The veto was a shrewd document, as was every argument written by that master of subtle logic. The president was made to say, "I share with Congress the strongest desire to secure to the freedmen the full enjoyment of their freedom and property, and their entire independence and equality in making contracts for their labor." But he objected to the bill because it was unconstitutional, because the Bureau was permanent, because it did for the colored people what had never been done for white people, because it confiscated land, and because its cost would be prodigious. It was unconstitutional because it extended jurisdiction all over the United States and gave the Bureau judicial power in that jurisdiction. It was made permanent in spite of the fact that slavery had been abolished. Conceive a president, born a poor white laborer, saying, "Congress has never felt itself authorized to spend public money for renting homes for white people, honestly toiling day and night, and it was never intended that freedom should be fed, clothed, educated, and sheltered by the United States." The idea upon which slaves were assisted to freedom was that they became a self-sustaining population. The Bureau, he said, would be costly. During war times, we had already spent $5,876,272 for the relief of Negroes, and $2,047,297 for the relief of whites. For 1866, the present Bureau needed $11,745,000. Now, we are planning to spend money for land and education, which will double this sum. The bill proposes to take away land from former owners without due process of law. Finally comes this extraordinary economic philosophy for serfs. Undoubtedly, the freedmen should be protected, but he should be protected by the civil authorities, especially by the exercise of all constitutional powers of the courts of the United States and of the states. His condition is not so bad. His labor is in demand, and he can change his dwelling place if one community or state does not please him. The laws that regulate supply and demand will regulate his wages. The freedmen can protect themselves, and being free, they could be self-sustaining, capable of selecting their own employment, insisting on proper wages, and establishing and maintaining their own asylums and schools. It is earnestly hoped that, instead of wasting away, they will, by their own efforts, establish for themselves a condition of responsibility and prosperity. It is certain that they can attain that condition only through their own merits and exhortations. They should just pull themselves up by the bootstraps. This was the answer of Andrew Johnson and William H. Seward to the Freedmen's Bureau Bill. Practically, it said that the Negroes do not need protection. They are free. Let them go to work, earn wages, and support their own schools. Their civil rights and political rights must depend entirely upon their former masters, and the United States has no constitutional authority to interfere to help them. As Stevens said later, the president himself favored confiscation of Southern land for the poor when he was clothed and in his right mind. It was an astonishing pronouncement. It was the American assumption of the possibility of labor's achieving wealth applied with a vengeance to landless slaves under caste conditions. The very strength of its logic was the weakness of its common sense. Yet, Andrew Johnson was the President of the United States. He was the leader of the Republican Party, which had just won the war. He declared in the face of an astounding array of testimony to the contrary that the South was peaceful and loyal, and the slaves really free. Congress did not believe the president or agree with him, but some were not yet prepared to break with him. 6 Republicans deserted their party and voted to uphold the veto. The result was that by a vote of 30 to 18, the attempt to override the president's veto failed. The rift made in the Republican Party was wide. On the one side stood abolition, democracy, in curious alliance with triumphant Northern industry, both united in self-defense against Johnson and the South. This Northern unity Johnson and Seward intended to disrupt, and did so in part when the veto of the Freedmen's Bureau bill was sustained. Seward followed this by an appeal for the quick resumption of peace and industry, and Johnson made an appeal to labor unrest and Western radicals. But here again, there was no natural union, and this Seward knew. His defense, therefore, of Johnson's plans was to intend to soothe both industry and abolition without stressing radicalism. Washington's birthday had been fixed upon by the president's friends for a grand demonstration. The New York aldermen endorsed the president's conservative, liberal, enlightened, and Christian policy with 100 guns salute on February 21st and 100 on February 22nd. Johnson was declared greater than Old Hickory. He was on the highest pinnacle of the Mount of Fame. His feet were planted on the Constitution of his country. He was a modern edition of Andrew Jackson, bound in calf. Indeed, it was said by the radicals in reply to the Democratic fireworks that more powder was burned in honor of the veto by the Copperheads than they consumed during the 4 years of war. Seward said at Cooper Union, "This, I think, is the difference between the president, who is a man of nerve, in the executive chair at Washington, and the nervous men who are in the House of Representatives. Both have got the Union restored, not with slavery, but without it. Not with secession, flagrant or latent, but without it. Not with compromise, but without it. Not with disloyal states or representatives, but with loyal states and representatives. Not with rebel debts, but without them. Not with exemption from our own debts for suppressing the rebellion, but with equal liabilities upon the rebels and the loyal men. Not with freedom and refugees abandoned to suffering and persecution, but with freedom employed in productive, self-sustaining industry with refugees under the protections of law and order. The man of nerve sees that it has come out right at last, and he accepts the situation. He does not forget that in this troublesome world of ours, the most to be secured by anybody is to have things come out right. Nobody can ever expect to have them brought out altogether in his own way. The nervous men, on the other hand, hesitate, delay, debate, and agonize, not because it has not come out right, but because they have not individually had their own way in bringing it to a happy termination. As to the Freedmen's Bureau bill, he said, I have not given prominence in these remarks to the conflict of opinion between the President and Congress, in reference to the Bureau for the relief of freedmen and refugees. That conflict is, in its consequences, comparatively unimportant. It would excite little interest and produce little division if it stood alone. It is because it has become the occasion for revealing the difference that I have already described that it has attained the importance which seems to surround it. He proceeded to point out that the present Freedmen's Bureau bill had not expired and might not expire for another year, and that, therefore, during the next year, Congress might still prolong its existence. Ought the President of the United States to be denounced in the house of his friends for refusing in the absence of any necessity to occupy or retain and to exercise power greater than those which are exercised by any imperial magistrate in the world? Judge ye. I trust that this fault of declining imperial powers, too hastily tendered by a too confiding Congress, may be forgiven by a generous people. This was an adroit defense, but Johnson could not let well enough alone. He was deprived of his mentor and assuming his vivid role of stump speaker, possibly with a few stimulants. He felt called upon the same Washington's birthday to reply to a committee which had waited upon him with resolutions. He was speaking after the 14th Amendment in its first form had been reported to the House of Representatives and sent back to the Committee of 15. With that, as well as the vetoed Freedmen's Bureau Bill and the pending Civil Rights Bill in mind, he recited again his services to the Union during the war. He reminded his auditors that when rebellion manifested itself in the South, he stood by the government. He was for the Union with slavery. He was for the Union without slavery. In either alternative, he was for the government and the Constitution. Then he went on with the classic argument. You have been struggling for 4 years to put down a rebellion. You contended at the beginning of that struggle that a state had not a right to go out. And when you determine by the executive a right to go out, and when you determine by the executive, by the military, and by the public judgment that these states cannot have any right to go out, this committee turns around and assumes that they are out and that they shall not come in. I say that when the states that attempted to secede comply with the Constitution and give sufficient evidence of loyalty, I shall extend to them the right hand of fellowship, and let peace and union be restored. I am opposed to the Davises and Toomses and Slidells and the long list of such. But when I perceive, on the other hand, men still opposed to the Union, I am free to say to you that I am still with the people. Suppose I should name to you those whom I look upon as being opposed to the fundamental principles of this government and now laboring to destroy them. I say Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania. I say Charles Sumner of Massachusetts. I say Wendell Phillips of Massachusetts. Finally, Johnson became melodramatic. Are they not satisfied with one martyr? Does not the blood of Lincoln appease the vengeance and wrath of the opponents of this government? Is their thirst still unslaked? Do they want more blood? Have they not honor and courage enough to effect the removal of the presidential obstacle otherwise than through the hands of the assassin? I am not afraid of assassins, etc., etc. Small wonder that the New York Tribune and the Philadelphia Press reported that Johnson was drunk when he made his speech. But the main cause of his drunkenness was not necessarily whiskey. It was constitutional inability to understand men and movements. This was not time to straddle on the slavery question. That question has been settled. The crucial question now was, what will the South do when it comes back to Congress? What will it do to Negroes? And even more important in the minds of many, what will it do to the new industry? The latter question struck deepest, but the former voiced itself louder. The masses of the loyal people must be as agreed to arise against this veto of a measure intended as a bulwark against slavery and treason, as they were on the night when the flag of the Union was first hauled down from Fort Sumter, said the Chicago Tribune. Congress immediately hit back with a concurrent resolution not to admit Southern congressmen to either house until the status of the Southern states was settled. This had passed the House of Representatives after dilatory tactics February 20th, but was not considered in the Senate until February 23rd after Johnson's speech. It was passed after debate March 2nd, and thus Stevens' original resolution of December 4th was finally confirmed. Here, evidently, there was a small ground for compromise. Either Johnson must bow to the will of the majority of his party in Congress, or, led by him, the South would be in the saddle in 1866. Many who had criticized Sumner in December now were on his side. The President and the South, on the other hand, were greatly encouraged. Despite the majority which the Republicans had in Congress, they could not override a presidential veto. With the reaction that Johnson and the South expected at the next election, the Republicans would lose power and the South, united with Northern and Western democracy, would rule. The Southerners resumed their drive to complete their black codes and their program of reducing the Negro to a servile caste. The president, drunk with his new feeling of power, showed his entire misapprehension of the nature of the forces working against him. Congress girded itself for battle, not mainly because the virtual re-enslavement of the Negro aroused them, but because this was the symptom of a reassertion of power on the part of the South which might affect the debt, the tariff, and the national banking system. The president and his supporters were going to insist upon the full political power of the South, unhampered by a Freedmen's Bureau or by Negro civil rights. Had it not been for the presence of the Negro, this attitude of the South could not have arisen. Never before in modern history has a conquered people treated their conqueror with such consummate arrogance. The South hid behind the darkness of the colored men and thumbed their noses at the nation. For the Negro, Andrew Johnson did less than nothing when once he realized that the chief beneficiary of labor and economic reform in the South would be freedmen. His inability to picture Negroes as men made him oppose efforts to give them land, oppose national efforts to educate them, and above all things, oppose their rights to vote. He even went so far as to change plans which he had thought out and announced before he faced the Negro problem. He once said that representation ought to be based on voters. But no sooner did he learn that Thaddeus Stevens advocated the same thing than he became dumb on the subject and had no advice to offer. He had advocated the confiscation of the land of the rich Southerners and penalties on wealth gained through slavery. When he realized that Negroes would be beneficiaries of any such action, he said not another word. He was a thick and thin advocate of universal suffrage in the hands of the laborer and common man, until he realized that some people actually thought that Negroes were men. He opposed monopoly on the New Jersey railroads until Charles Sumner joined them. The Civil Rights Bill, which was taken up next, made Negroes citizens of the United States and punished any person who deprived them of civil rights under any state law. They shall have the same right in every state and territory in the United States to make and enforce contracts, to sue, be parties and give evidence, to inherit, purchase, lease, sell, hold, and convey real and personal property, and to full and equal benefit of all laws and proceedings for the security of person and property as is enjoyed by the white citizens, and shall be subject to like punishment, pains, and penalties, and to none other, any law, statute, ordinance, regulation, or custom to the contrary notwithstanding. It gave to the district courts of the United States jurisdiction in crimes and offenses against the act, gave the power of arrest to the United States marshals and district attorneys, and provided fines and penalties. David Bingham of Ohio brought up a difficulty. He reminded Congress that the first 8 amendments of the Constitution could not be enforced by the federal government, since they were held to be limitations upon the federal power, and that, therefore, the power to punish offenses against life, liberty, and property was one of the reserved powers of the state. He, therefore, suggested a constitutional amendment which would punish all violations of the Bill of Rights by any state officers. He reminded the House that even when property had been taken by the states without due process of the law, there was no remedy in the federal courts, and that this had been affirmed in a recent case in Maryland. His proposal went to the Committee of 15. The Civil Rights Bill passed the Senate, was amended in the House, and was agreed to by both houses, March 14, 1866. The debate on the Civil Rights Bill and the Freedmen's Bureau Bill made it clear that the emancipation of the slaves meant increased representation in Congress and in the Electoral College whenever the Southern states were readmitted, and that this increase in power would take place whether the Negroes were enfranchised or not. Moreover, the Civil Rights Act might be repealed. The United States might be made to pay all or a part of the Confederate debt, and Congress might repudiate the debt. The debate, therefore, on the Civil Rights Bill made the necessity of a constitutional amendment clear. On March 27th, President Johnson vetoed the Civil Rights Bill with curious logic. He feared that under this bill, Chinese, Indians, and Gypsies, as well as Negroes, might be made citizens. He declared that a citizen of the United States would not necessarily be a citizen of a state. He again questioned whether it was good policy to act on citizenship of Negroes, since 11 of the 36 states were unprecedented. 4 million of them have just emerged from slavery into freedom. Can it be reasonably supposed that they possess the requisite qualifications to entitle them to all the privileges and equalities of citizens of the United States? One wonders what Andrew Johnson expected the Negroes to be. Like me. They were not to be citizens. They were not to be voters, and yet he repeatedly assured them that they were free. He went on with another strange argument, declaring that the bill discriminated against large numbers of intelligent, worthy, and patriotic foreigners, and in favor of the Negro, to whom, after long years of bondage, the avenues of freedom and opportunity have just now been suddenly opened. Thus, he thought Negroes less familiar with the character of American institutions than foreigners. And yet, foreigners must wait 5 years for naturalization and be of good moral character. He said that if Congress could give the equal civil rights enumerated to Negroes, it could also give them the right to vote and the right to hold office. He objected to state officers being liable to arrest for discriminating against Negroes. He objected to the interference of Congress with the judiciary and assuming jurisdiction of subjects which had always been treated by state courts. Again, he returned to his astonishing economics. The white race and the black race of the South have hitherto lived together under the relation of master and slave, capital owning labor. Now, suddenly, that relation is changed, and as to ownership, capital and labor are divorced. They stand now each master of itself. In this new relation, one being necessary to the other, there will be a new adjustment, which both are deeply interested in making harmonious. Each has equal power in settling the terms, and if left to the laws that regulate capital and labor, it is confidently believed that they will satisfactorily work out the problem. Capital, it is true, has more intelligence, but labor is never so ignorant as to not understand its own interests, not to know its own value, and not to see that capital must pay that value. This bill frustrates this adjustment. It intervenes between capital and labor and attempts to settle questions of political economy through the agency of numerous officials, whose interest it will be to foment discord between the two races. For as the breach widens, their employment will continue, and when it is closed, their occupation will terminate. He declared that this law establishes for the security of the colored race safeguards which go infinitely beyond any that the general government have ever provided for the white race, and therefore discriminates against the white race. He declared the bill a step toward concentrating all legislative power in the national government. A perfect equality of the white and colored races is attempted to be fixed by federal law in every state of the Union over the vast field of state jurisdiction covered by the enumerated rights. In no one of these can any state ever exercise any power of discrimination between the different races. He then fetched up his heavy artillery of social equality to stampede the prejudiced. In the exercise of state policy over matters exclusively affecting the people of each state, it has frequently been thought expedient to discriminate between the two races. By the statutes of some of the states, northern as well as southern, it is enacted, for instance, that white persons shall not intermarry with a Negro or a mulatto. While he did not believe that this particular bill would annul state laws in regard to marriage, nevertheless, if Congress had the power to provide that, there should be no discrimination in the matters enumerated in the bill. Then it could pass a law repealing the laws of the states in regard to marriage. He continued, Hitherto, every subject embraced in the enumeration of rights contained in this bill has been considered as exclusively belonging to the states. They all relate to the internal police and economy of the respective states. If it be granted that Congress can repeal all state laws discriminating between whites and blacks and the subjects covered by this bill, why, it may be asked, may not Congress repeal, in the same way, all state laws discriminating between the two races on the subject of suffrage in office? Speaking of the general effect of the bill, he declared it interfered with the municipal legislation of the states, with the relations existing exclusively between a state and its citizens, or between inhabitants of the same state. An absorption and assumption of power by the general government, which, if acquiesced in, must sap and destroy our federative system of limited powers and break down the barriers which preserve the rights of the states. It is another step, or rather stride, towards centralization and the concentration of all legislative powers in the national government. The president's veto of the Civil Rights Bill offended the nation. Senator Stewart declared that the president had promised not to veto this bill, and for that reason the senator had voted to sustain the veto of the Freedmen's Bureau bill. Senator Trumbull had publicly announced that the president would not veto the Civil Rights Bill. Henry Ward Beecher had urged him to sign it. Even in the president's cabinet, none of the members except Seward and Wells agreed with Johnson. Sumner wrote, "Nobody can yet see the end. Congress will not yield. The president is angry and brutal. Seward is the marplot." In the cabinet, on the question of the last veto, there were 4 against it to 3 for it. So even there, among his immediate advisors, the president is left in a minority. Stanton reviewed at length the bill, section by section, in the cabinet and pronounced it an excellent and safe bill every way from beginning to end. But the veto message was already prepared and an hour later was sent to Congress. The time for the final test between Johnson and Congress had come. There ensued some sharp political maneuvering. Morgan, Wiley, and Stewart were won over to the majority, and Stockton, a Johnson man from New Jersey, was unseated on a technicality. Thus, on April 6th and 9th, Congress overrode the veto. The Civil Rights Bill became law, and Johnson faced a Congress able to work its will. There was one other matter, besides amending the Constitution, on which Congress might take significant action. According to the current American creed, full protection of a citizen could only be accomplished by possession of the right to vote. This was not wholly true, even in the North, and with the ballot in the hands of white men. Nevertheless, it still retained a great element of truth, for only with universal suffrage could the mass of workers begin the economic revolution which would eventually emancipate them. They would have to use their ballot at first in conjunction with the petty bourgeois. We know the petty bourgeois. Come on, y'all. Somebody stay with me now. That is, in conjunction with the small property holder, who was being hard-pressed by the new concentrated capital of industry. In conjunction with the small Western farmer, who was pushed to the wall by the railway and land monopoly. But armed with the ballot, this preliminary fight against the power of capital would clear the way, the final fight, which would make democracy real among the workers. While the Committee of 15 was groping its way to action, there was a chance for Congress to express its real feeling on the ballot. There might be a question in the minds of constitutional hair-splitters as to how far Congress could coerce states in defining the right of suffrage. But Congress ruled directly the District of Columbia. Congress had the right to decide as to the political franchise in territories. Would it not be the first step toward a logical and consistent end for Congress to establish Negro suffrage in the district and in all territories which were set up? Thus, among the first bills introduced in the 39th Congress were bills to give the Negro the right to vote in the District of Columbia, and this demand was supported by petitions and speeches, and especially well-written petitions from the educated Negroes of the district. In January 1866, there came a notable petition from the colored people signed by John F. Cook, a wealthy octoroon of a free Negro family, and 25 other citizens. It did not come from freedmen or laborers, but from property holders of Negro descent, many of whom had been born free. Kelly of Pennsylvania read it in part to the House. We are intelligent enough to be industrious, to have accumulated property, to build and sustain churches and institutions of learning. We are and have been educating our children without the aid of any school fund, and until recently had for many years been furnishing unjustly, as we deem, a portion of the means for the education of the white children of the district. We are intelligent enough to be amenable to the same laws and punishable alike with others for the infraction of said laws. We sustain as fair a character on the records of crime and statistics of pauperism as any other class in the community, while unequal laws are continually barring our way in the effort to reach and possess ourselves of the blessings attendant upon a life of industry and self-denial and virtuous citizenship. Experience likewise teaches that the debasement is most humane, which is most complete. The possession of only a partial liberty makes us more keenly sensible of the injustice of withholding those other rights which belong to a perfect manhood. Without the right of suffrage, we are without protection and liable to combinations of outrage. Petty officers of the law, respecting the source of power, will naturally defer to the one having a vote, and the partiality thus shown will work much to the disadvantage of the colored citizens. However, there were some special reasons for avoiding this ticklish subject. After all, Washington was the capital of the nation. It had long been a center of Southern society. To give the Negroes political freedom and partial control there was a long step and a decisive one. The people of the district hastily organized a counterstroke and presented to the Senate a communication from the mayor in which he asserted that a special vote had been taken December 21st to ascertain the opinion of the people of Washington on the question of Negro suffrage. He meant, of course, the white people, and the vote was overwhelming. 6,591 against Negro suffrage and 35 for it. The communication proceeded in a fine climax of Southern rhetoric to say that this unparalleled unanimity of sentiment which pervades all classes of this community in opposition to the extension of the right of suffrage to that class engenders an earnest hope that Congress, in according to this expression of their wishes, the respect and consideration they would as individual members yield to those whom they immediately represent, would abstain from the exercise of its absolute power, and so avert an impending future apparently so objectionable to those over whom, by the fundamental law of the land, they have exclusive jurisdiction. A long argument ensued, which showed that Congress was not ready to declare itself on Negro suffrage. Further action was postponed for another year. And a bill for Negro suffrage in the District of Columbia did not pass Congress until December 1866. It became a law in January 1867. Meantime, the Committee of 15 had met first December 26, 1865. Charles Sumner was considered too radical on the Negro question to be a member of it, and so the committee was headed by a conservative, Fessenden of Maine, who wished to stand by President Johnson and was strongly, sometimes even bitterly, opposed to the radicalism of Sumner. Stevens, the great protagonist of curbing the political power of the South and completely emancipating the Negro, was the prime figure in the committee. Then there were Bingham of Ohio, the more or less conscious defender of property, Conkling of New York, the sophisticated, exquisite corporation lawyer, and Boutwell of Massachusetts. There were 3 Democrats, of whom the most distinguished was Johnson of Maryland, the strongest border state representative in Congress, handicapped by a legal mind, and the narrow-minded Rogers of New Jersey. A subcommittee of the Committee of 15 courteously waited on President Johnson, and he consented to do nothing more toward Reconstruction for the present in order to secure harmony of action. On December 26th, at the first meeting of the committee, Stevens brought forward his proposal to base representation on voters. And singularly enough, later in the same month, Johnson, in an interview with Senator Dixon of Connecticut, said that if, however, amendments are to be made to the Constitution, changing the basis of representation and taxation, parentheses, and he did not deem them at all necessary to the present time, close. He knew of none better than a simple proposition, embraced in a few lines, making in each state the number of qualified voters the basis of representation, and the value of property the basis of direct taxation. Such a proposition could be embraced in the following terms. Representatives shall be apportioned among the several states, which may be included within this union according to the number of qualified voters in each state. Such amendment, the President also suggested, would remove from Congress all issues in reference to the political equality of the races. It would leave the states to determine absolutely the qualifications of their own voters with regard to color, and thus the number of representatives to which they would be entitled in Congress would depend upon the number upon whom they conferred the right of suffrage. The President, in this connection, expressed the opinion that the agitation of the Negro franchise question in the District of Columbia at this time was a mere entering wedge to the agitation of the question throughout the states, and was ill-timed, uncalled for, and calculated to do great harm. He believed that it would engender enmity, contention, and strife between the two races, and lead to a war between them, which would result in great injury to both and the certain extermination of the Negro population. Precedence, he thought, should be given to more important and urgent matters, legislation upon which was essential to the restoration of the Union, the peace of the country, and the prosperity of the people. Here, surely, was logic and understanding in plain sight. But not only did the President eventually drop this proposal, but even in committee, opposition appeared. Boutwell suggested that at the third meeting of the committee, January 9th, that he preferred to retain population as the basis of apportionment, with the provision that no state should make any distinctions in the exercise of the elective franchise on account of race or color. Boutwell was from Massachusetts, and New England, through Blaine, had protested vigorously against the Stevens proposition in the House the day before, January 8th. It was a curious situation, which Blaine explained in part, and in part he did not. New England had lost a good proportion of its male population by migration to the West, and it did not allow women to vote. New England, moreover, had a large immigrant population in which she was using in her mills and on which a part of her representation in Congress was based. She proposed to make this population still larger. She proposed, also, to reduce the voting power of this laboring population not only by confining the vote to the native-born and naturalized, but also by literacy qualification. Through Blaine, therefore, spoke the exploiting manufacturer and voiced an idea as different from Sumner's as one could well imagine. To base population on voters was, in the eyes of industry, to keep down the representation of the South, to be sure, but also to transfer the balance of political power from the East to the West, and in the West industry was not so sure of its dictatorship. Consequently, the Committee of 15 was compelled to take steps in another direction. On January 12th, Bingham introduced a proposal to the committee for a constitutional amendment guaranteeing civil rights. It is said, the Congress shall have the power to make all laws necessary and proper to secure all persons in every state within this union equal protection in their rights of life, liberty, and property. This proposition, destined to become part of Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, had been introduced early in December in the House of Representatives. The Committee of 15 referred the Bingham proposal to a subcommittee consisting wholly of Republicans. At the same time, the committee insisted that the basis of representation provided for in the Constitution should be changed. Johnson of Maryland adhered to the new Stevens proposal of making voters the basis. New England and New York objected, and this matter was left to the consideration of the same subcommittee. Meantime, 3 other propositions were submitted. 1. Representation should be based on population, but if colored people were disenfranchised, they should not be counted in the apportionment. And that's from Morrill. Number 2, representatives should be apportioned according to population, except that Negroes, Indians, Chinese, and other colored persons, if they were not allowed to vote, should not be counted in the apportionment. That's from Williams. Number 3, representatives were to be apportioned among the states according to the whole number of citizens of the United States, provided that whenever in any state civil or political rights or privileges should be denied or abridged on account of race or color, all persons of such race or color should be excluded from the basis of representation or taxation. Conkling. On January 16th, a proposed 14th Amendment was considered in 2 parts. The first part had alternative propositions. A. Apportioning representation according to the number of citizens and making inoperative and void any laws whereby any distinction is made in political or civil rights or privileges on account of race, creed, or color. B. The alternative proposition was the Conkling proposal. The second part of the amendment was Bingham's proposal that Congress shall have power to make all laws necessary and proper to secure to all citizens of the United States the same equal protection in the enjoyment of life, liberty, and property. These propositions went to subcommittees and were reported back January 20th. The civil rights section of Bingham appeared in the strongest and most specific form which it ever took. Congress shall have power to make all laws necessary and proper to secure to all citizens of the United States, in every state, the same political rights and privileges, and to all persons in every state, equal protection in the enjoyment of life, liberty, and property. It was voted 10-4 to consider this proposition of Bingham separately, and by a vote of 11-3, the second resolution on apportionment was chosen as a proposed 14th Amendment. This excluded from representation Negroes who were denied the right to vote. Stevens wished to amend this by declaring who were citizens. Conkling, however, moved to strike out the phrase citizens of the United States and insert persons in every state, excluding Indians not taxed. This was a move to ensure the counting of the foreign-born as a part of the basis of apportionment and was in accordance with the New England idea. Stevens, Fessenden, and Bingham were against it, but it passed 11-3. On January 22nd, this section on apportionment was reported to Congress as a 14th Amendment and was the first effort of the Committee of 15 to prepare for Reconstruction by constitutional amendment. This was before the Freedmen's Bureau Bill or the Civil Rights Bill had passed Congress, and the bill for suffrage in this District of Columbia, while it had passed the House, had not been considered in the Senate, and was not destined to be for several months. This fact is a sufficient answer to the accusation that the Committee of 15 purposefully delayed action on the problems of Reconstruction. Within less than a month after it began work, it laid its first proposition before Congress. Stevens reported this first form of the 14th Amendment to the House and asked rather peremptorily that it pass before sundown. His reason was that there were numbers of state legislators in session and that they could consider it immediately. But he was disappointed. There was too much opposition in his own group. Conkling elaborated and made specific the argument which Stevens had first brought forward. The 4 million people who had suddenly been released from slavery, while falling within the category of free persons, were not yet political persons. This emancipated multitude has no political status. Emancipation vitalizes only natural rights, not political rights. Enfranchisement alone carries with it political rights, and these emancipated millions are no more enfranchised now than when they were slaves. They never had political power. Their masters had a fraction of power as masters. But since the relationship of master and slave was destroyed, this fraction of power could no longer survive in the masters. There was only one place where it could logically go, and that was to the Negroes. But since it was said that they are unfit to have it, it is a power astray without a rightful owner. It should be resummed by the whole nation at once. If a black man counts at all now, he counts as 5/5 of a man, not as 3/5. 4 millions, therefore, and not 3/5 of 4 millions, are to be reckoned in here now. And in 11 states, most of these 4 millions were presumed to be unfit for political existence. Since the framers of the Constitution did not foresee such contingency and expected that emancipation would come gradually and be accompanied by education and enfranchisement, they provided for no situation whereby 11 states might claim 28 or 29 representatives besides their just proportion. 28 votes to be cast here and in the Electoral College for those held not fit to sit as jurors, not fit to testify in the court, not fit to be plaintiff in a suit, not fit to approach the ballot box. 28 votes to be more or less controlled by those who once betrayed the government. And for those so destitute, we are assured of intelligent instinct as not to be fit for free agency. Shall this be? Shall 4 million beings count 4 million in managing the affairs of the nation, who are pronounced by their fellow beings unfit to participate in administering government in the states where they live, who are pronounced unworthy of the least and most paltry part in the political affairs? Shall 127,000 white people in New York cast but one vote in this House and have but one voice here, while the same number of white people in Mississippi have 3 votes and 3 voices? Shall the death of slavery add 2/5 to the entire power which slavery had when slavery was living? Shall one white man have as much share in the government as 3 other white men, and merely because he lives where blacks outnumber whites 2 to 1? Shall this inequality exist, and exist only in favor of those who did the foulest and guiltiest act which crimsons the annals of recorded time? No, sir. Not if I can help it. This proposition, he continued, rests upon a principle already embedded in the Constitution and as old as free government itself. A principle that representation does not belong to those who have no political existence, but to those who have. The object of the amendment is to enforce this truth. Every state will be left free to extend or withhold the elective franchise on such terms as it pleases, and this without losing anything in representation if the terms are impartial as to all. If, however, there is found a race so vile or worthless that to belong to it is alone cause of exclusion from political action, the race is not to be counted here in the Congress. Thus spoke New York in cold contrast to Thaddeus Stevens, but with quite a merciless logic. This argument made it clear that the basis of representation must be changed in some way, unless the South was coming back with increased political power. What change should be made? The West wanted Stevens' original proposition, which had early been introduced in Congress by Stevens himself, and also separately by 2 Ohio representatives, and which based representation on voters. But this proposition would have increased the power of the middle and western states at the expense of New England, and New England had had her warning from Voorhees. While, then, a majority of Republicans undoubtedly favored this, the proposition could not pass Congress without the support of New England, and the West yielded. Eliot of Massachusetts submitted an amendment, which was practically the 15th Amendment. But it was agreed that this could not pass Congress. And so, finally, the report was sent back to the Committee of 15. Meantime, on January 22nd, the Bingham Amendment on Civil Rights was considered in the Committee of 15 and referred to a subcommittee, after Boutwell had tried to make its wording milder by saying that Congress shall have power to abolish any distinction in the exercise of the elective franchise. On January 27th, this section was reported from the subcommittee with modifications and appeared now in the following words. Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper to secure to all persons in every state full protection in the enjoyment of life, liberty, and property, and to all citizens of the United States the same immunities and also equal political rights and privileges. It was postponed. Bingham explained in 1871 that, after postponement, he had introduced this section of the amendment in the Committee of 15 in the words in which it now stands in the Constitution. He had changed the form in the hope that the amendment might be so framed that, in all the hereafter, it might be accepted by the historian of the American Constitution, like Magna Carta, as the keystone of American legislation. The decision of Marshall versus the City Council of Baltimore, a celebrated case, has induced him to take counsel with Marshall. Thus, curiously enough, constitutional restraints designed to protect persons were changed into a form which eventually made the federal government the protector of property against state enactments. The Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper to secure to the citizens of every state all privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states. This substitute, which Bingham reported to the committee February 3rd, was adopted in the Committee of 15, and on February 10th, by a vote of 9-5, it was referred to Congress. It came up before the House of Representatives February 13th as a proposed constitutional amendment and was debated at length February 27th through the 28th, when the House refused to table it but postponed it until April. When the Committee of 15 received the amendment on apportionment back from the House, it made the minor change of taking out the reference to direct taxes, which was irrelevant and of little importance. So that, again, January 31st, the proposition came back to the House of Representatives. Stevens was unequivocal. I do not want them, the Southern states, to have representation. I say it plainly. I do not want them to have the right of suffrage before this Congress has done the great work of regenerating the Constitution and laws of this country according to the principles of the Declaration of Independence. Again, Schneck of Ohio tried to base representation on voters, but this was defeated. Stevens said that he favored it, but that it could not pass Congress. The House passed this form of the 14th Amendment, January 3rd, 1866, and sent it to the Senate. In the meantime, the whole aspect of the political situation changed. The Freedmen's Bureau bill had passed Congress and, to the astonishment of the country, had been vetoed. The Civil Rights Bill had passed the Senate, and Johnson had made his speech on February 22nd, definitely aligning himself now with the South and their Northern Democratic allies, and against his own party. Black codes had been passed in Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, Florida, Virginia, and Louisiana. On the other hand, Northern business was afraid. Viewed as a practical matter, asked the nation, what would be the effect upon government securities of the immediate admission to Congress of 58 Southern representatives and 22 senators, nearly all of whom could be counted on as determined repudiationists? It would hardly be a safe thing for the national credit to have such a body of men in Congress, reinforced as they would probably be by a considerable number of Northern men ready to go for at least qualified repudiation. Seward himself, it is said, was greatly disappointed and embarrassed by the black codes of the South. He found that the South was getting stronger in Johnson's confidence. Nemesis again dogged Seward's steps, as when before he was defeated for the presidential nomination by the anti-slavery men to whom he had given a slogan. It was then that Toombs had sneered, Actaeon had been devoured by his dogs. The dogs were at it again. Blaine says that when Congress reassembled after the holidays, there was a great change in its attitude. Many feared that the president and the Democrats together would win. The leading commercial men, who had become weary of war, contemplated with positive dread the reopening of a controversy which might prove as disturbing to the business of the country as the struggle of arms had been, and without the quickening impulses to trade which act of war always imparts. The bankers of the great cities, whose capital and whose deposits all rested upon the credit of the country and were invested in its paper, believed that the speedy settlement of all dissension and the harmonious cooperation of all departments of the government were needed to maintain the financial honor of the nation and to reinstate confidence among the people. Against obstacles so menacing, against resistance so ominous, against an array of powers so imposing, it seemed to be an act of boundless temerity to challenge the president to a contest, to array public opinion against him, to denounce him, to deride him, to defy him. The Committee of 15 paused to get its bearings. In the first place, what was the attitude of the country toward Negro suffrage? In 1865, Wisconsin had rejected a proposal to let Negroes vote. Minnesota, the same year, had defeated a constitutional amendment giving Negroes the suffrage. Connecticut, also in 1865, gave a majority of 6,272 against Negro suffrage. Later, in 1867, Ohio defeated Negro suffrage by 50,629. In Michigan, in 1868, a new constitution, omitting the word white, was defeated by a majority of 38,849. In the Nebraska Constitution of 1866, only whites were allowed the suffrage. In New York and some other states, there was special legislation on the voting of Negroes, which was not changed. Evidently, the country was not ready for Negro suffrage. Moreover, the pinch of economic difficulties following the war was beginning to be felt. The price of gold, which was at 170 in 1864, rose to 284 in 1865. The income tax had been increased in 1865. The United States was paying out vast sums of interest on its annual debt. Cotton was high, selling at 43 cents a pound in 1865. It dropped to 30 cents only in 1866, with a crop of 1,900,000 bales, as compared with that marvelous crop that precipitated the Civil War, 5,740,000 bales in 1861. The price of agricultural products had increased, but not nearly as much as the prices of manufactured goods, and the farmers were feeling the difference. Gambling and speculation were widespread. The United States Treasury was trying to reduce the circulation of the depreciated greenbacks, and under the Act of 1866, retired some $75 million. But early in 1868, the contraction of the currency was prohibited, and the West began to cry for inflation. A Western editor wrote Senator Trumbull of Illinois, "You all in Washington must remember that the excitement of the great contest is dying out, and that commercial and industrial enterprises and pursuits are engaging a large part of public attention. The times are hard. Money is close. Taxes are heavy. All forms of industry here in the West are heavily burdened. And in the struggle to pay debts and live, people are more mindful of themselves than any of the fine philanthropic schemes that look to making Sambo a voter, juror, and office holder." That word. Johnson knew nothing of finance and left the Treasury entirely to McCulloch, who was struggling, October 31st, 1865, with a national debt that stood at $2,800,000,000. There was still doubt of the legal tender constitutionality of the greenbacks. Taxation was enormous and applied to almost every available subject. There faced the country a tremendous problem of reorganizing the debt, reestablishing the currency, and reducing the revenue. Stevens had rushed the Committee of 15 as fast as, or faster than, his majority wished. The first draft of the 14th Amendment reached the Senate and was attacked by Charles Sumner. There was no greater proof of his courage, and his learning and keenness of mind were unquestioned. From the day of his great speech on Kansas to his unswerving advocacy of civil rights for Negroes and their political enfranchisement, he towered above his contemporaries. He was unwilling to compromise like Stevens, and for that reason was not made head of the Great Committee of 15. But there was no question about his integrity and his idealism. Sumner had no sympathy with an amendment which made the disenfranchisement of Negroes possible and regarded it as another compromise with human rights and a discrimination on account of race and color, which hitherto had been kept out of the Constitution. Thus, the first proposition which Northern industry made met the direct opposition of abolition democracy. Charles Sumner, in a tremendous speech, February 6, 1865, laid down the thesis that under no circumstances should it be possible to disenfranchise a man simply on account of race or color. That here, for the first time, we had a chance to realize the democracy which the fathers of the Republic foresaw, and he spoke prophetic words on future disenfranchisement. I am not insensible to the responsibility which I assume in setting myself against a proposition already adopted in the other house, and having the recommendation of a committee to which the country looks with such just expectations, and to which, let me say, I look with so much trust. But after careful reflection, I do not feel that I can do otherwise. There are among us 4 millions of citizens now robbed of all share in the government of their country, while at the same time they are taxed according to their means, directly and indirectly, for the support of the government. Nobody can question this statement. And this barefaced tyranny of taxation without representation, it is now proposed to recognize as not inconsistent with fundamental right and the guarantee of a republican government. Instead of blasting it, you go forward to embrace it as an element of political power. If by this you expect to induce the recent slave master to confer the right of suffrage without distinction of color, you will find the proposition a delusion and a snare. He will do no such thing. Even the bribe you offer will not tempt him. If, on the other hand, you expect to accomplish a reduction of his political power, it is more than doubtful if you will succeed, while the means you employ are unworthy of our country. There are tricks and evasions possible, and the cunning slave master will drive his coach and 6 through your amendment stuffed with all his representatives. Should he cheat you in this matter, it will only be a proper return for the endeavor on your part to circumvent him at the expense of fellow citizens to whom you are bound by every obligation of public faith. Seldom had a great political prophecy been so strikingly fulfilled. Stevens in the House had, by his diplomacy, ranged back of his policy the industrial leaders of the North who feared that a return of the South would mean attack upon the tariff, the national banks, the debt, and the whole new post-war economic structure. Sumner, in the Senate, on the other hand, took little account of the political game. He set his strategy on the high ground of democracy, and democracy for all men, and it was his opposition that killed the first draft of the 14th Amendment, which permitted the disfranchisement of Negroes on penalty of reduced representation. Stevens, with infinite pains, had gotten this much through the Committee of 15 and the House of Representatives. Sumner spoke his convictions despite the desertion of friends and party. Senator Williams of Oregon expressed admiration, but could not follow him. The echoes of his lofty and majestic periods will linger and repeat themselves among the corridors of history. Ooh.